Teresa asks a question. This is a good one. There's a lot of controversy between the Novus Ordo and the Latin Mass. Is one better than the other? Good question. Yeah. So the most important thing to remember is that the Mass is the Mass. Where the value of the Mass really comes from is the fact that it is the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross. It's literally a sacrifice of infinite value, and that is present in the ordinary form, or Novus Ordo, and in the extraordinary form, what's sometimes called the Latin Mass. And so, considering, there is an infinite value that comes from there, everything else is absolute detail. It's minor details in the comparison between the two. After we think about the inherent, or the ontological value is the fancy word to use, of the Mass, the propitiatory value of the Mass, you can think about the secondary purpose of the liturgy, which is essentially to aid the people in prayer and in devotion. Basically, the Mass as a set prayer should form the faith of the people attending Mass. And at that level, you can make a lot of arguments one way or the other. I think there are good parts to both. So there's no official church teaching on this. In Summorum Pontificum, which I think was written in 2008, Pope Benedict made it very clear that these are two separate forms of the Mass, both of which are good. They have their own pluses and minuses. In my opinion, the Second Vatican Council happened, and it needed to happen. There needed to be a reform of the liturgy. Changes needed to be made. And so the extraordinary form of the Latin Mass has problems with it that are not the best thing for today, for the average parish today. However, I also think that the ordinary form, or the Novus Ordo, is not celebrated as the Second Vatican Council actually called it to be celebrated. And so we have this problem where the majority of places that you find either of the two Masses, it's not ideal, because it's not really what the Church called for in the Second Vatican Council. And so we're kind of working with two imperfect solutions. And so I'll talk about some of the pluses and minuses of each. First off, with the extraordinary form, the Latin Mass. The Latin Mass has one benefit in that it is in Latin. Latin is not a language that is really developing anymore. It's not spoken by enough people so that it has a different meaning from one location, or so that the vocabulary does not develop through time or by location. So I'm sure, we've got some people from Scotland that always connect into here. I'm sure they kind of chuckle to themselves every once in a while because I say certain things that mean one thing in America and another thing in Scotland. It's a problem that we always have. Also, if you've read any of the, not Old English, but something like Shakespeare, people have a hard time reading Shakespeare. Why? Well, because the English language has developed, and he uses certain words that would have been very common. Really, for Shakespeare's time, he wrote in very simple English. But for our time, those words have shifted, and it's only somebody who has a very good vocabulary that can grasp all of the meaning of all of the words that he's using, because you have to have an understanding of how English used to be used several hundred years ago. And so one of the beauties about Latin in the liturgy is that the Latin still means the same thing. And so there is a way that the faith is preserved and the meaning of the liturgy is preserved when we use Latin. Another really great thing about the Latin Mass is that the reverence and the reality of the sacrifice is very clearly shown in the Latin Mass. The rubrics are fairly strict. um, at least for everybody that's in the sanctuary. So the priest has to do a certain thing. If it's a solemn high mass, the deacon has to do a certain thing. The subdeacon has to do a certain thing. You know, each of the servers has their own role. And if there's music in the mass, there is certain music that ought to be used, and that music is very sublime and beautiful and respectful. And so that helps people. It's that outward expression to help them to reinforce that respect that is owed to God, and that kind of stability of the faith. That this is, the faith is not something that changes. We're here, we're stable, we're before God. And a lot of people that I've spoken to that have gone to the Latin Mass, they say like, wow, that was definitely absolutely all about God. Like, we were rendering worship to God. That comes through clearly in the Latin Mass. Some of the drawbacks of the Latin Mass are that it is fairly rigid. So there's a low Mass, which means that there's no singing, and then there's a high Mass, which means that there's quite a bit of singing, and then there's a solemn high Mass. And really, those are the only three forms that the high Mass or the sung Mass can actually. There's a little bit of variation in how you can celebrate that. You can have incense or not, basically. But for example, if I want to be able to sing something, but I don't have a choir that can sing all of the Mass parts, well, I have to say a low Mass. I can't sing anything. Or similarly, if you have a priest that just can't sing at all, but you have this amazing choir, well, in the extraordinary form, if the priest can't sing, you can't have a sung Mass. And so there is a rigidity that doesn't necessarily fit today very well. There is also the issue of basically nobody in the 21st century knows Latin. And so it seems like a whole bunch of gibberish to somebody that doesn't know any Latin at all. And perhaps, some people perhaps are just like very sharp or well educated and can appreciate, a foreign language, and they can still follow along in English, and it's all perfectly fine. But that's just too much for some people. And so it's not an effective way to draw them into that worship because of the Latin. So the Latin is a plus and a minus, and the rigidity and the music and things of that sort is a plus and a minus all at the same time. In the ordinary form, some of the really great things are that we are allowed to use the vernacular. You can use whatever language it is that you're most comfortable in. And so that's really good because it allows people to, or it helps people to engage their mind as well. And it makes it much more accessible to a lot more people. Also, there is a great flexibility in being able to kind of piecemeal things together in the ordinary form so that, assuming it's being led well, you can make the most beautiful Mass that, the talents available in that group can make happen. And so, if the priest can sing, great, that priest can sing basically everything and it's no problem. Even if there's not a choir that can sing things, or if you have this amazing choir, well, the choir can sing all sorts of things and the priest can just say his parts and it all works out fine. Also, with the ordinary form, there's a larger selection of readings, which is really nice. So we read a lot more of the Bible throughout the liturgical cycle. And in fact, the Sunday readings are on a 3-year cycle, and the weekday readings are on a 2-year cycle. And so we get through a lot more of the Bible in the Mass, which is great. There's a lot more exposure to more of the scriptures. The drawback to that is that if you come across a reading only once every 2 years if you're going to daily Mass, or once every 3 years if you're going just to Sunday Mass, then you never really learn the Bible. You're exposed to it, but it's not in your mind. It's not locked in there. And so the wider net kind of means basically less depth, or it doesn't penetrate as deeply into the heart, unfortunately. And so that's kind of a drawback of the ordinary form. And then also the flexibility with the ordinary form. One of the problems is that people take it a little bit too flexibly and really just destroy the Mass. They make it their own prayer, right? I mean, I talked about it at the beginning of this live stream, that the liturgy is God's prayer that we enter into. But so often people try and manhandle the liturgy and do whatever they want with it, and they make it their own prayer instead of the prayer of the church, the universal body of Christ. And so it's much more open to abuses in that sense, which is not okay. Yeah, so those are some of the pluses and minuses. There were also some of the prayers that were changed in the Novus Ordo that kind of lost some of the theological richness that was present in the extraordinary form, and so that's a bummer. But there were also more prayers added in, so there's a kind of greater diversity and beauty in some of the prayers in the Novus Ordo. So lots of pluses and minuses. My tendency, so I learned Latin fairly early on in the seminary and spent a lot of time studying it, and so I really like Latin. It's kind of become the language that I talk to God in. Just, it's kind of neat. We've got like our own little language that I only talk to God in Latin. So the Latin Mass, just always whenever Mass is celebrated in Latin, is very natural for me, and I like that. But I also recognize that's a personal preference. It's not a universal thing that I have to push on everybody. And I do think that the Novus Ordo, when it is celebrated outstandingly well, can be as reverent and as beautiful as the extraordinary form. But there are very, very few places in the world that celebrate the Novus Ordo in that most reverent and beautiful way that you can do it, just because so to get a skill level of musicians and servers and priests and deacons and lay faithful that understand and that can participate in it in the most beautiful way is hard to find. There's not a lot of that, but baby steps, right? That's my job.